I'll never forget the look on Uncle Robert's face when the attorney read my father's will. His eyes narrowed to slits, jaw clenched so tight I swear I heard teeth crack. The mahogany conference room suddenly felt arctic cold as he turned to glare at me. "This is ridiculous," he spat, slamming his palm on the polished table. My brother was not in his right mind. "This will, it's invalid." My hands trembled beneath the table, but I kept my face composed. Dad had warned me this would happen. He knew his older brother better than anyone. 3 days after burying my father, my rock, my only remaining parent since Mom died when I was 12, I was already fighting for what was rightfully mine. "Mr. Campbell," the attorney said calmly, "your brother's wishes are quite clear. The family business, the house, and the majority of the assets transfer to Emily." He nodded toward me. He designated these arrangements years ago, well before his illness. Uncle Robert stood up so fast his chair crashed against the wall. "This isn't over," he hissed, pointing his finger at me. "You manipulated him when he was sick. You've always been the little princess, haven't you? Well, princess, get ready for war." As he stormed out, I realized I'd been holding my breath so long my lungs burned. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a determination I'd inherited from the man we'd just laid to rest. Dad had prepared me for this moment. What Uncle Robert didn't know was that I'd already set the wheels in motion to protect everything my father had built. Growing up in the sprawling Victorian on Maple Street, I'd always believed our family was tight-knit. Dad built Campbell Construction from nothing after Grandpa died, and Uncle Robert joined the company when I was about 5. From the outside, we looked like the perfect family business success story in our small Connecticut town. But beneath the surface, resentment festered. Uncle Robert always believed he deserved more control, more credit, more of everything. While Dad worked 18-hour days, Uncle Robert took extended vacations and claimed credit for my father's innovations. Dad, ever the peacemaker, never confronted him. "Family is complicated, Emmy," he'd tell me. Roberts always felt overlooked. It's easier to just let him have his moments. After Mom died of cancer, Dad poured himself into two things, raising me and growing the business. By the time I graduated college with my business degree, Campbell Construction had contracts across 3 states. I joined the company immediately, eager to learn everything from the ground up. Uncle Robert hated it from day one. My presence threatened his position as Dad's right-hand man. The snide comments started small suggestions that I'd been handed everything on a silver platter, implications that I wasn't qualified despite my degree and work ethic. When Dad promoted me to operations director after just 3 years, Uncle Robert stopped speaking to me altogether. "You won't last a month in that position," he'd sneered in the hallway after the announcement. "You may have fooled your father, but we both know you're playing dress-up in a world you don't understand." I worked twice as hard to prove him wrong. When Dad was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer last year, I stepped up even more. While I drove Dad to chemo appointments and managed the business, Uncle Robert suddenly became scarce, citing important meetings that no one could verify. What he didn't realize was that during those final months, Dad and I had long conversations about the future, about his legacy, and about the promises I made to him that I intended to keep, no matter what obstacles or Uncle stood in my way. The weeks following the funeral were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Uncle Robert showed up at the office every day, acting as if he'd already taken control. He scheduled meetings with our biggest clients without telling me, changed project timelines, and even tried to reassign my team to his supervision. "I'm just studying the ship," he announced during a staff meeting I was deliberately not invited to. Someone recorded it on their phone and sent it to me later. "Emily is understandably emotional right now, and this business needs experienced leadership, not sentiment." The betrayals multiplied. I discovered he'd been telling suppliers that I planned to sell the business. Two project managers resigned after private meetings with him where he'd implied I would be downsizing their departments. The office manager who'd worked with Dad for 15 years tearfully showed me emails from Uncle Robert directing her to forward all company financial documents to his personal account. The final straw came when Dad's banker called. "Emily, I'm concerned. Your uncle came by yesterday requesting access to your father's personal accounts. He presented himself as the executor of the estate. When I explained that wasn't what our records showed, he became insistent. That night, I found my office door lock broken, desk drawers ransacked. The file containing Dad's handwritten notes about the future of the business, including evidence of Robert's past misappropriation of company funds, was missing. The violation felt physical, like someone had broken into my home rather than my office. I drove to Dad's house, my house now, technically, and sat in his study, surrounded by photos of the two of us through the years. The mounting pressure crushed against my chest until I could barely breathe. Uncle Robert was systematically dismantling everything Dad had built, everything he'd trusted me to protect. The weight of it all finally broke through the dam I'd built around my emotions. For the first time since the funeral, I allowed myself to collapse completely, sobbing until my throat was raw and my eyes swollen. I'd never felt more alone or more doubtful of my ability to fight this battle. The next morning, I arrived at the office before sunrise. With red-rimmed eyes but resolute determination, I changed every passcode, every security access point in the building. Then I called an emergency board meeting excluding Uncle Robert. "I've gathered you today to address the elephant in the room," I said, standing at the head of the conference table where Dad used to sit. My voice shook slightly, but I pressed on. "My uncle is actively undermining this company, spreading misinformation, and attempting to seize control against my father's explicit wishes." I distributed folders containing documentation of everything: the unauthorized client meetings, the financial access attempts, statements from employees about his sabotage. As of this moment, Robert Campbell is suspended from all company operations pending a full investigation into ethical violations and potential financial misconduct. I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. This was my father's company. He entrusted it to me. I will not allow anyone, family or otherwise, to destroy what he built. When Uncle Robert stormed in 20 minutes later, security was waiting. The look of shock on his face as they escorted him from the premises nearly broke my resolve. He'd never expected me to fight back. Not sweet, accommodating Emily who'd spent her life trying to keep peace in the family. "You'll regret this," he shouted as the doors closed behind him. "You have no idea what you've started." His words felt prophetic. Within hours, I received notice that he'd filed an emergency petition contesting the will, claiming Dad had been unduly influenced by me during his illness. He demanded a temporary freeze on all assets and company operations pending court review. The war had officially begun, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to win it. When I was 16, I overheard an argument between Dad and Uncle Robert that changed how I saw our family. I'd been homesick from school, curled up in the window seat of the upstairs hallway with a book, when their voices carried up from Dad's study below. "You've always been like this, James," Uncle Robert's voice seethed with contempt. "Dad always favored you. The golden child who could do no wrong. Then you got the girl I wanted, built the business I should have started, and now you act like letting me work here is some kind of charity. That's not true, Rob. I've always seen us as equal partners." "Equal?" Uncle Robert laughed harshly. "You own 70%. I get the scraps you throw me while you groom your precious daughter to take over someday. Emily works harder than anyone." Dad's voice hardened. "She's earned her place here. She's a child playing entrepreneur in Daddy's office." There was a crash. Someone had slammed something down. Then Dad's voice, quieter but ice cold. "Don't you ever speak about my daughter that way again. Emily has more integrity and business sense at 16 than you've demonstrated in your entire life." The reason you don't own more of this company isn't because I didn't offer it to you. It's because you refused to put in the work. That night, Dad found me sitting on the back porch swing, confused and hurt. How long has Uncle Robert hated us? I asked. Dad sighed, settling beside me. Rob doesn't hate us, Emmy. He hates himself, and that's a much harder thing to live with. He wrapped an arm around me. Promise me something. No matter how successful you become, never let your self-worth depend on tearing others down. That's the prison your uncle lives in. Years later, during Dad's final weeks, he revisited this conversation as we sat in his hospital room. Robert will come after everything when I'm gone, he whispered, his once strong hand now fragile in mine. Not because he needs it, but because he believes it should have been his all along. I can handle Uncle Robert, I assured him. Dad's eyes, still sharp despite his failing body, held mine. I know you can. That's why I've made arrangements. The question is when the time comes, will you also know when to let go of the fight? Some battles scar us more in victory than they would have in surrender. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. Now, weeks into a vicious legal battle with my own blood relative, those words haunted me. What scars was I willing to bear to protect Dad's legacy? And which would cut deeper, fighting or surrendering? The unexpected call came on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 months into the legal nightmare. Emily Campbell? This is Diane Reynolds. I was your father's executive assistant at Millerbrooks before he started his own company. The name vaguely registered. Dad had worked at a large construction firm before founding Campbell Construction, but that was before I was born. I heard about James passing and this trouble with Robert, she continued. I've been following it through industry circles. I think there's something you should know. We met at a quiet cafe across town. Diane was in her 60s now, elegant with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen much. Your father and I stayed in touch over the years, she explained, stirring her tea. James was a remarkable man, honest to his core in an industry where that's rare. She reached into her purse and pulled out a sealed envelope, slightly yellowed with age. He gave me this 15 years ago, right after your mother passed. Said if anything ever happened to him, and if Robert caused problems, I should find you and give you this. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a notarized document with attached bank statements and a handwritten letter from Dad. Your uncle came to your father for a loan when his gambling debts threatened his marriage, Diane explained quietly. James paid off over $200,000 to bookies and loan sharks on the condition that Robert get help and work at the company under James's mentorship. Your father never held it over him, never told a soul except me as his notary. I scanned the documents, understanding blooming like a painful revelation. This loan agreement gave Dad controlling interest in the company from the very beginning. Diane nodded. Robert didn't build that company with James. He was given a lifeline by your father when he was at his lowest. The partnership was your father's way of giving him purpose and a second chance. Why didn't Dad ever tell me? Because James believed everyone deserves dignity and the chance to rewrite their story. He never wanted you to see your uncle as the man he once was, only as the man he could become. As I stared at my father's familiar handwriting, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just ammunition for a legal battle. It was a window into who my father truly was and a mirror reflecting who I wanted to be. There's something else, Diane said, her voice gentler now. Your father made me promise to tell you that whatever you decide to do with this information, make sure it serves building rather than destroying. That was his life's philosophy. I left the cafe with my mind spinning and my heart aching with a new understanding of both my father and the uncle who seemed determined to destroy me. The courtroom fell silent as my attorney placed the notarized loan documents on the evidence table. Uncle Robert's face drained of color, then flushed crimson as realization dawned. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but he shook the man off, eyes locked on me with a mixture of rage and something else. Was it shame? These documents clearly establish the origins of Campbell Construction and the nature of the partnership between James and Robert Campbell, my attorney stated. Additionally, we've submitted James Campbell's private journals documenting Mr. Robert Campbell's subsequent attempts to manipulate company finances over a 15-year period, attempts that James Campbell addressed privately to preserve family harmony. The judge reviewed the evidence carefully, occasionally glancing up at Uncle Robert, whose composure was visibly crumbling. When the court recessed for 30 minutes, I expected him to flee. Instead, he approached me in the hallway, his lawyer trailing behind protesting. "Where did you get those documents?" he demanded, voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "Dad protected them, just like he always protected you." The words came out steadier than I felt. "All these years, I never knew the truth. How you came to him desperate, how he saved you from bankruptcy and possible criminal charges from your bookies. How he gave you a job, a purpose, a second chance, and you repaid him with resentment and betrayal." Something broke in his expression. "You don't understand what it's like to live in someone's shadow your entire life." "No, I don't," I agreed. "Because Dad never made me feel that way. The shadow you lived in, Uncle Robert, was one you created yourself." His eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him in years. "I loved my brother. Despite everything, I loved him." "I know. That's the tragedy of all this. He loved you too enough to protect your secrets until the end." The bombshell came when court resumed. My attorney stood and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we have one final piece of evidence." 3 weeks before James Campbell's death, anticipating his brother might contest the will, he filed additional legal documentation with the state transferring official ownership of all business assets to his daughter, Emily Campbell. This transfer was completed, notarized, and recorded while James Campbell was of sound mind, as attested by his doctors. He presented the paperwork documents I'd helped Dad prepare during those final, precious weeks together. The ownership transfer had been completed nearly a month before Dad's death, making the current probate dispute essentially moot. Uncle Robert collapsed back in his chair as if physically struck. His entire case, built on claims that I'd manipulated Dad during his final days, disintegrated in an instant. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Dad had been planning this transition for years, long before his diagnosis. As the implications settled over the courtroom, I felt no triumph, only a profound sadness for what could have been if jealousy and resentment hadn't poisoned our family. The legal victory left me hollow. Campbell Construction was unquestionably mine now. The court battle decisively ended, but the cost had been steep. Family employees took sides. Old friends of Dad's questioned the public airing of private matters, and Uncle Robert disappeared completely after the final hearing. A month later, I was working late when I found myself drawn to Dad's old office, a room I'd preserved exactly as he left it. I sank into his worn leather chair, running my fingers over the desk where he'd taught me to read blueprints as a child. "I did it, Dad," I whispered to the empty room. "I protected everything, just like I promised." But victory tasted ashen. The company was secure, yet something essential felt damaged beyond repair. That Sunday, I drove to the cemetery with fresh flowers for Dad's grave. To my shock, Uncle Robert was there, kneeling by the headstone. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, hair grayer than I remembered from just weeks before. My instinct was to retreat, to avoid another confrontation. Instead, I heard Dad's voice in my mind. "The measure of our character isn't how we treat those who help us, but how we respond to those who've hurt us." I approached quietly, placing my flowers beside the ones he'd brought. "His favorite," Uncle Robert said hoarsely, gesturing to the white lilies he'd selected identical to mine. "He kept them in his office every spring." "I remember," I replied. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he spoke again. "I found the journals he kept about me. He left them in my desk drawer." All these years, he knew everything, every scheme, every bitter thought. He documented it all, but he never exposed me. Never used it against me. His voice broke. Why? Because he believed people could change. That holding on to anger only poisons yourself. I sank down onto the grass beside him. He never stopped hoping you'd become the brother he knew you could be. Uncle Robert's shoulders shook with silent sobs. I've lost everything. My brother, my job, my dignity. Something shifted in me then, a weight lifting I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. The need for vindication, for triumph over the man who'd tried to destroy me, suddenly seemed small and insignificant compared to the legacy of compassion Dad had tried to instill in both of us. You haven't lost everything, I said finally. You still have family. If you want it. That afternoon, sitting by Dad's grave, we didn't resolve years of damage in a single conversation. But we began something new, a fragile bridge built on shared grief and the recognition that Dad had loved us both, flaws and all. 6 months after the court case, Campbell Construction celebrated its 25th anniversary. The gala event brought together employees, clients, and community members who'd supported us through the years. I stood at the podium, looking out at the faces that represented Dad's legacy. Before I begin the formal presentations tonight, there's an announcement I'd like to make, I said, my voice steady with newfound confidence. Campbell Construction is creating a new division focused on community development and affordable housing projects, work that was always close to my father's heart, but that business realities often pushed to the background. I paused, sensing the surprise ripple through the crowd. This initiative will be headed by someone who knows this company's history intimately and who shares my vision for its future. Please welcome the director of our new Community Impact Division, Robert Campbell. The murmurs grew as Uncle Robert walked onto the stage. He looked transformed not just by the new suit or the trimmed hair, but by a humility that had replaced his former arrogance. He shook my hand formally before turning to the microphone. Thank you, Emily. Many of you know about the recent difficulties in our family. What you may not know is that my niece had every legal right and personal justification to remove me from this company permanently. He looked at me, his eyes clear and direct for perhaps the first time in our relationship. Instead, she offered something my brother tried to teach me for years, that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. This new division represents everything James Campbell stood for: building things meant to last, creating opportunities where none existed. Later, as we shared a quiet moment away from the celebration, Uncle Robert handed me a small wrapped package. I found this in your father's storage unit. I think he would want you to have it now. Inside was Dad's first hammer, worn with use, his initials still visible on the handle. With it was a note in his handwriting, for Emmy, who always understood that building takes more courage than destroying. This built our first project. Your wisdom will build its future. The tears came then, not from grief, but from something deeper: the sense that the jagged pieces of our broken family were finally being rebuilt into something new, strong in its repaired places. 1 year after Dad's death, Campbell Construction broke ground on its most ambitious project yet, a mixed-use development that included retail space, market-rate apartments, and affordable housing units named in Dad's honor, the James Campbell Community. I stood at the ceremonial groundbreaking, hard hat on, surrounded by the extended family we'd built, employees who'd been with Dad for decades, new team members bringing fresh ideas, and Uncle Robert, who had channeled his competitive drive into making the Community Impact Division an unexpected success. My father used to say that buildings are really stories written in concrete and steel, I told the gathered crowd. They tell us what a community values, what it aspires to be. This project tells the story of second chances, of turning conflict into collaboration, of honoring the past while building toward a future with room for everyone. As I pressed the ceremonial shovel into the earth, I spotted a familiar figure at the back of the crowd: Diane Reynolds, who delivered Dad's letter when I needed it most. She smiled and nodded slightly, as if to say, he would be proud. That evening, I invited the core team back to the house on Maple Street, the family home I'd finally made my own after months of leaving Dad's things untouched. Uncle Robert arrived last, hesitating at the threshold of a place where he'd once been unwelcome. "Come in," I said, holding the door wider. Dad always said this house was too big for one person anyway. As conversation and laughter filled rooms that had been too quiet for too long, I slipped away to Dad's study, now my study, and opened his worn leather journal to add my own entry, continuing the company history he'd documented so faithfully. "The true legacy isn't buildings or bank accounts," I wrote. "It's the courage to choose reconciliation over revenge, growth over grievance." Dad understood that all along. He knew that sometimes what looks like losing a battle actually means winning something far more valuable, the chance to break cycles of hurt instead of perpetuating them. I closed the journal and rejoined the gathering, catching Uncle Robert's eye across the room. The nod we exchanged held a year's worth of hard conversations, tentative trusts rebuilt, and the shared understanding that Dad's greatest gift wasn't the company he left behind, but the example he set of leading with compassion, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. Sometimes I visit the construction site alone at sunset, when the workers have gone home and the half-built structure stands silhouetted against the fading light. I run my hand along the exposed beams that will someday support families I'll never meet, businesses not yet imagined. In those quiet moments, I often hear Dad's voice. "Anyone can build walls, Emmy. The real art is in building bridges." The estate he left me wasn't just property and assets. It was the understanding that our most important inheritance isn't what we receive, but what we choose to build with it and who we become in the process.